What if the only person who knew the truth about a string of brutal murders decided to confess? Not to bring peace, but to play one final game before disappearing forever. The room was quiet except for the faint whir of an old tape recorder. A worn cassette clicked into place, and then came the voice. Steady, calm, almost casual. "If you're hearing this, it means I've already gone," the man began. His name was James, though to those who suspected his crimes, he was something else entirely. A predator who slipped through cracks in the system, leaving behind only questions. But this time, James wasn't running. Instead, he left a message. A confession laced with riddles, half-truths, and dark memories. It wasn't closure. It was a labyrinth. And at the end of it, James promised something chilling. The answer to his greatest secret. The tape recorder clicked on with a faint hum, the sound of its spools filling the silence of the room. The man leaned back in his chair, his face hidden in shadow, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. His voice, when it finally broke the quiet, was low and steady, almost too calm for what he was about to confess. "My name doesn't matter," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "By the time you hear this, I'll be gone. Maybe I'll be dead. Maybe I'll just be a ghost in another town. But I can't carry this anymore. They deserve to know. All of them." The confession would later be described as one of the most haunting ever recorded. Not just because of what it revealed, but because of what it left behind. Questions that would never be answered, victims who might never be found, and a man who simply vanished into the cracks of the world after bearing his sins. It began, as many tragedies do, in a place no one would expect. The man who called himself James on the tape was not the monster people might imagine. He wasn't the shadow lurking in alleyways or the vagrant muttering on street corners. He was a man who, by all outward appearances, lived an ordinary life. He held down jobs, construction, truck driving, a mechanic's assistant. He rented rooms in small towns, blending into the background. If you passed him on the street, you wouldn't have looked twice. That was his strength. But hidden beneath that ordinary exterior was a darkness that stretched back decades. In the recording, James admitted that his first kill had been an accident, or so he claimed. A bar fight in 1982, somewhere in Kansas, when tempers ran too high and fists gave way to something sharper. The man he fought never walked out of that bar alive. James fled, his knuckles bruised, his shirt soaked in blood, and for weeks he lived with the sickening fear of being caught. But the police never came. The death was written off as a drunken brawl gone wrong. The killer never found. "That's when I knew," he said on the tape, his voice cracking for the first time. "That's when I realized I could get away with it." The killings that followed were not accidents. Over the next 20 years, James drifted from state to state, leaving behind a trail of disappearances that never quite connected. A waitress in Oklahoma, a hitchhiker in Arizona, a college student whose car broke down outside Amarillo. He never gave details that could identify them fully, never names, never exact dates. But his descriptions matched open cases scattered across the Midwest and Southwest. What chilled investigators most when they later analyzed the recording was not just the crimes themselves, but the way James described them. There was no anger in his voice, no hatred for his victims. Instead, he spoke of control, of silence, of the strange sense of calm that came after. "It was never about them," he said. "It was about me, about making the noise in my head stop." But then the tape shifted. James spoke of someone he called her. Not a victim, at least not at first. She was the one person who seemed to anchor him, who pulled him back from the edge when the compulsion threatened to swallow him whole. Her name, he said, was Anna. She worked at a diner in New Mexico, serving coffee with a tired smile. For the first time in his life, James felt something like peace. He stopped drifting, stayed in the small desert town for nearly a year. He even talked about marrying her. But peace never lasts long for men like James. In the recording, his voice broke again as he admitted what happened next. "I thought I could change," he said. "I thought maybe love was enough. But the darkness came back. And when it did, it took her too." Investigators would later pore over missing persons reports, trying to match Anna to any real case. They found a handful of possibilities, but nothing that fit perfectly. To this day, no one knows if Anna was real, or if she was just another ghost James conjured in his confession. The tape ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if he'd simply put out his cigarette, stood up, and walked away. When authorities searched the motel room where the recorder was found, James was already gone. The bed was neatly made, the key left on the nightstand. No fingerprints, no ID, no trace of where he'd gone. Just the tape, a map of horrors, a voice from the shadows. When investigators first pressed play on the recorder left behind in that shabby motel room, they didn't quite know what they were listening to. Was it a hoax, a deranged fantasy, or a genuine confession? But as James's voice filled the small evidence room, seasoned detectives exchanged uneasy glances. Too many details matched. Too many echoes of unsolved cases whispered through his words. The motel itself, located just off a highway in rural Nevada, offered little to go on. The manager described James as quiet, polite, the kind of man who paid cash and asked for nothing more than a room with a working heater. He checked in under a false name, stayed 3 nights, and vanished without a word. The room was left spotless, almost unnaturally so, as though he'd scrubbed away his presence. The only clue was the recorder. Agents from the FBI were called in. They listened to the tape again and again, cataloging every pause, every word. James mentioned cities, highways, the smell of desert sage, the clink of pool balls in a bar somewhere in Texas. His voice painted landscapes investigators knew too well. Places where bodies had once been found, cases that had haunted them for decades. One detective, a graying veteran from Oklahoma, slammed his fist on the table after the 3rd listen. "He's telling the truth," he said. "I worked the waitress case in '91. Everything he said, the bruises, the way she was found, it lines up. He's not making this up." Soon, a task force was assembled, combing through cold cases across 6 states. The sheer scope was overwhelming. From 1982 to the early 2000s, dozens of disappearances and unsolved homicides could fit James's timeline. Women vanished from highways, truck stops, and diners, their names etched into forgotten police files. For families who had long since given up hope, James's words felt like a cruel resurrection of grief. But there was a problem. James never gave enough. He spoke in riddles, in fragments, his confessions more like brushstrokes than photographs. He said things like, "She wore a yellow scarf that night," or "I left him near the cottonwoods by the river." But no exact names, no dates. Detectives found themselves chasing ghosts. And then there was Anna. The mention of her, his supposed anchor, the woman he claimed to love and then destroy, sent investigators down a rabbit hole. They scoured missing persons records in New Mexico, cross-checking women who worked in diners in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Several names emerged, but none fit perfectly. A waitress named Angela who disappeared in Albuquerque. A woman called Annette who was last seen near Gallup. A drifter known only as Annie who vanished outside Santa Fe. Each possibility felt close, but James's words remained maddeningly vague. Was Anna real, or was she symbolic? A stand-in for every woman he ever hurt, rolled into one impossible figure? The FBI considered releasing the tape to the public, but there was hesitation. If James was alive and still out there, would going public drive him deeper into hiding? Or worse, provoke him to kill again? For months, investigators worked quietly, tracing old rental records, interviewing motel clerks, chasing faint echoes of a man who never stayed in one place long enough to leave a trail. A pattern began to emerge. James favored highways, small towns near truck stops, places where strangers passed through unnoticed. His life was transience, and his crimes fed off that. But then, in early 2004, something strange happened. A letter arrived at a police station in Amarillo, Texas. It was scrawled on lined notebook paper. No return address. The handwriting uneven but firm. "You're listening now, aren't you? You've heard me. I wasn't lying. You'll never find them all. But maybe you'll find her. Maybe that's enough." The signature was chillingly simple. J. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The handwriting bore strong similarities to notes taken from the motel room. The envelope carried no fingerprints, no traceable DNA. But the postmark was real. It came from a small town in northern New Mexico. Detectives swarmed the area, interviewing postal workers, motel owners, clerks at gas stations. But James, or Jay, was gone, as if he'd melted into the desert air. The case dragged on, piling up reports, maps, timelines. Each new tip felt like chasing a phantom. Some believed James had died, his body hidden in some anonymous graveyard of forgotten men. Others believed he was still out there, older now, but no less dangerous, watching from the margins as investigators tried and failed to catch him. Families of victims began to gather together, forming a network of grief and determination. They shared stories, details, photos, anything that might link their loved ones to James's words. Some felt hope for the first time in years. Others felt only rage, that he had confessed but not delivered closure, that he had dangled their pain like bait before disappearing again. One mother of a missing girl stood at a vigil, clutching her daughter's photo, tears streaking her face. "If he wanted forgiveness," she said, "he should have given us their names. He should have told us where they are. Not this, not half-truths and riddles." And yet, buried in the frustration was a truth the investigators couldn't ignore. James's confession had weight. It had too many coincidences, too many parallels with real crimes. The tape was no hoax. Somewhere out there, the man who recorded it was still living, breathing, carrying the burden of what he'd done. And then, years later, came another clue. A second tape. It was mailed to a local news station in Denver, wrapped in brown paper, no return address. The anchor who opened it thought it was another crank submission, until she pressed play. The voice was older now, raspier, but unmistakably the same. "I told you I'd be gone," James said. "But I'm still here. You didn't listen. You never listen. Maybe you don't want to." The tape ended with a sound that sent shivers down the spine of every investigator who heard it. A woman's faint laughter in the background, distant but real. Was it Anna, another victim, or a trick, planted to torment those still hunting him? No one knew. The second tape sent investigators spiraling once more. The woman's faint laughter, so quiet it could have been a trick of the recorder, ignited fierce debate. Some swore it was real, that James had kept another victim captive, taunting them from beyond reach. Others argued it was staged, a cruel way of reminding the world that he alone controlled the story. The FBI reopened dormant files, mapping James's supposed path across the West. Truck stops, motels, highways. He had become a ghost in America's forgotten places. Each detail he had confessed matched some piece of reality, but never enough to pin down the whole truth. It was as if James had built his legacy on half-shadows, ensuring no one would ever fully unravel him. Journalists branded him the Vanishing Confessor. Families of missing loved ones begged for answers. And yet, despite the years of searching, no one ever saw James again. He left behind fragments, words, riddles, scars on communities, but never the closure he hinted at in his tapes. And perhaps that was his final cruelty. Not the murders themselves, but the silence that followed. Was Anna real? Was the laughter genuine? Did James die in obscurity? Or is he still alive somewhere, watching the world chase his ghost? We may never know, but his voice remains, etched into tape and memory. A killer who spoke just enough to haunt us forever, before vanishing into the void. Do you think James was seeking redemption with his final confession? Or was it only another twisted game? And if he's still alive, do you believe he'll ever resurface? If you want more chilling true crime stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the next mystery waiting to be uncovered.